The Blue Jackets have a ton of blue chip, blue line prospects. Do they need another one, though? That's what we're talking about on today's Locked on Blue Jackets.
You're Locked on Blue Jackets, your daily podcast on the Columbus Blue Jackets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked on Blue Jackets, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. I am, as always, your host, Jay Foster, here to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly about your favorite team and mine, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for making this your first listen of the day every single day. Locked on Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms and over on YouTube. I also have to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app, use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to go to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Today we are going to swap the order of what's going to happen. Today is this morning was going to be a recap of the Carolina Hurricanes game, but that's going to come later tonight instead. Right now we're doing another prospect profile. I've got Brock Otten of McKeen's Hockey, and we're going to be talking all about Artyom Levshunov, who is a very exciting defenseman playing at Michigan State this season. So we're going to talk about him. We're going to look at how he matches up against some of the other defensemen that we've talked about that could be available for the Blue Jackets in that 3 to 6 spot. So I'm just going to get right into my conversation with Brock. The Blue Jackets are potentially in need of another defenseman. And why not go with maybe the most interesting defenseman in draft conversation right now, in that no one really seems to know what to do with him. So we're going to talk about Artyom Levshunov today, and we've got a new prospect expert on the show. We've got Brock Otten, who is the director of scouting over at McKeen's Hockey. Brock, thanks for coming to talk to me about a couple of defensemen today, but let's just kind of start off with the basics on Levshunov. What kind of player is the team that drafts him getting?
Yeah, you kind of nailed it when you said that he's incredibly interesting, and the reason is the upside is very high, right? When you're looking at some of the defenders available this year, Levshunov has that very intriguing package of size and skill, which, let's be real, doesn't grow on trees, right? And that's why he's being considered a potential top 5, top 7 selection this year. Is he a perfect player currently? Absolutely not. And that's something that I'm sure we're going to discuss, Jay, but he does have a very intriguing set of tools, especially in the offensive end, gives him a very intriguing upside.
Yeah, for sure. And it's hard to argue with a defenseman that puts up almost a point per game on maybe the best college hockey team in the country.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been talking about Ziboyam and what he's been able to accomplish this year and how good he's been historically from a point perspective. But Levshunov's been right there with him. And I would argue on a program that isn't necessarily as star-studded or loaded offensively as Denver is. So I think you have to look at what he's done this year, Levshunov, that is, and almost put it on par with what Ziboyam has done with Denver. And I think that when you combine it with what he was able to do last year in the USHL and just how he was able to take over that league, we're talking about a guy who hasn't been in North America very long, right? And I think there's still a bit of a learning curve there. And I think if you're drafting Levshunov high, you're anticipating that he's going to continue to get better at both ends, and some of those kinks are going to get ironed out in his game.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk about Boom in a second, because I think those two players are going to be compared basically for the rest of their careers if they both play for a long time in the NHL. But Levshunov was really interesting to me because I feel like it's so rare for a non-North American to play in the NCAA, and obviously he played in the USHL last season, like you said. And is it literally just that it's so rare because so many European players will play quote unquote pro hockey before they turn 18 and are eligible for college, and that then makes them ineligible for the NCAA? Or is it just that it's a long way to go for, would they rather play men's hockey than college hockey? I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a lot of things that go into it. For one, you mentioned it. These players tend to turn pro a little bit younger when they're playing overseas, and they get those opportunities to earn a little bit of money, right, compared to players in North America. So there is that sort of opportunity that's available to them that removes them from NCAA eligibility. But we are seeing more and more, especially out of Finland and Sweden, more and more players joining the NCAA ranks. We're seeing a few next year as well. I think in Levshunov's case, with him being from Belarus, I think the biggest reason that we're seeing him in the NCAA is because the CHL banned Russian and Belarusian players. Before that happened, there was definitely a lot of talk regarding Levshunov being a high pick in the CHL import draft. That obviously didn't happen with the war that's ongoing there and the ban that is still ongoing on Russian and Belarusian players. And it sort of worked out very well for Levshunov with his commitment to Michigan State and with how well he's played in the NCAA. So it has worked out really well for him. I think it's definitely a more rare occurrence for players from, say, Russia or Belarus to see them in the NCAA. Definitely becoming more and more common for Sweden and Finnish players. I wonder, is it something that we're going to continue to see an increase of? I think NCAA hockey, the USHL, has done a really good job marketing themselves, not to just players in the United States, but to outside the United States. We're seeing an influx of Canadian players. We've always had Canadian players, but we're talking about high-end Canadian players. Your Adam Fantillis, who obviously you guys are extremely familiar with. Macklin Celebrini is a high-end one. Michael Hagg this year for Chicago is going to be playing NCAA next year, right? It's just kind of becoming a larger trend, and I don't think the CHL is incredibly happy about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm a huge fan of. I think it's great when players choose to go the college hockey route, just because I don't know. Maybe it's I hit my 30s and was like, but what about their education? What are they going to do after hockey? So I think them going to college is really great, and obviously getting to play hockey at the same time. I think the USHL is such an interesting league in how it's kind of developed over the past 5 years, maybe. I know my friend used to cover the Chicago Steel, kind of intermittently, and it was just kind of a bunch of teenagers messing around. But now you look, obviously, Adam Fantilli came from Chicago, went straight to Michigan, and then had the best freshman college hockey season since Paul Correa. So clearly they're doing something right. Is that a league-wide thing? It feels like that they're almost kind of, they're trying to keep up with the USNTP, which obviously plays in the USHL. Is that kind of is the league responding to this one team being dominant for so long by saying, okay, we need to get a little bit more parity in the league? And is that kind of what we're seeing now?
I think just the influx of talent has made the USHL better. In the last decade, there's just more high-end American players, and we're seeing that, through results in international competition. We're seeing it with an influx of high-end players making the NHL. We're seeing it it's reflected in the quality of NCAA hockey. We're seeing more and more players from overseas, from Canada, heading to the USHL and to the NCAA. It's become a premier feeder league for the National Hockey League, and I think that is definitely a good thing for the game to have better and more feeder leagues than just, say, the CHL for junior hockey players. I kind of want to touch on what you said. I think that when you look at the debate, I think one of the debate that is CHL versus USHL, NCAA, right? It's been an ongoing debate for ages. It's going to continue to be an ongoing debate. What's the best route? I think the one thing that really handicaps the CHL currently is just the CBA and how it exists. And that is, when a player is drafted out of the CHL at 18, right? NHL teams have 2 years to decide whether they're going to sign them to an ELC or not. So it's a 2-year window. An NHL team drafts a player out of high school, out of the USHL, out of a prep school league in the US. That window is much larger. The clock doesn't start ticking until those players head to NCAA. And then you've got that 4-year window, and then you have to decide after their senior season. You can sign them earlier, obviously, if you want. But now we're talking about an NHL team having to make a decision on a 20-year-old, a CHL player, whether they're going to sign them or not, based on what they've seen in their development, or, a 22, 23-year-old. And obviously, development is nonlinear. The more years you have to see a player and what they're able to show you and what their development looks like and how they mature physically and how they respond to a lot of different circumstances, the more opportunity you have, the better, right? So NHL teams are really onto this, and we're seeing more and more players drafted out of United States leagues, be it high school, be it USHL, be it the NAHL, be it prep leagues, right? We're seeing more and more players drafted because that window to sign, that window is there for them developmentally compared to other leagues. And it's a major advantage. And I think that's one thing that definitely hurts the CHL right now. And we're seeing less and less CHL players drafted, more signed as, overagers, 21, 20-year-olds. We're seeing that still an avenue that NHL teams are exploring, and rightfully so. We're seeing a lot of players end up being good NHL players from that route. But it definitely, I'm not going to use the word bias because that wasn't the intention, but I think inadvertently it's created a bit of bias now against the CHL for NHL teams when they're drafting, at least in when we're talking about rounds 4 to 7.
In a minute, I've got more of my conversation with Brock about Levshunov, but first, I'm going to tell you guys about Sleeper, because the season's almost over, and I think the less said about the Blue Jackets' performance, the better. But regardless of that, you could win big by playing Daily Fantasy Hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. They're our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially daily fantasy hockey, because you can win 100 times your money in those daily fantasy hockey contests. They've also got NFL, NBA, MLB, college football on Sleeper, but let's be honest, I'm here for the hockey, and I guess that you are too. Entries can be made in under a minute. All you have to do is pick whether guys like David, Ovechkin, Crosby, McKinnon will record more or less in their Sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in any given game. You win 100 times your money on Sleeper. All you need to do is correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. That's right, Blue Jackets fans. You can win 100 times your money by just getting 8 questions right. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. This wasn't this wasn't how I wanted this question to go originally, but it's really interesting, so we're going to keep going. I think also probably that CHL agreement with the NHL that stops them from going to the AHL. Obviously, college players can go to the NHL, go to the AHL basically immediately. We saw Ken Johnson, for example, tore up the AHL when he was down there this season as a 19-year-old who I think he turned 20 during the season. So there's definitely, I think it used to be that the CHL was the premier place for North American junior hockey or major junior hockey, and now I think more options is always a good thing, right? And I think it's going to force the CHL to maybe change some of their rules to try and keep up. Otherwise, they're going to get left behind.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think there's a lot of things that are going into it. NILs is another one, right? These players in the NCAA are having an opportunity to actually make a little bit of money by playing college hockey, and that's big. And the opportunity to turn pro earlier and play in the AHL as a 19-year-old. They go to school for 1 year, leave, they can play in the AHL and make money and develop and still have that same sort of path opportunity available to them. So yeah, there's a lot of things that I think within the CBA negatively impacts the CHL and their route to the NHL, at least in terms of the opportunities provided to them. And that's why we're seeing more players. I know that it's probably not up your alley, but the OHL draft is coming up in a few weeks. And there is some top end talent, again, leaving to the United States from that draft. It's becoming more and more of an issue in the OHL especially. And I don't know what the answer is going to be in the future, but there has to be some sort of counter from the CHL here.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk a little bit more about Levshunov, who is, like I said, almost a point per game player for Michigan State. What do you think his kind of development path looks like? Is he a guy that gets drafted, makes that jump to the NHL, or is he a guy that goes back for his sophomore year, maybe even his junior year? Like, why do you think he kind of sits in terms of his development?
Yeah, I think that he's probably a player who definitely goes back for his sophomore year. I think that he's not ready defensively. I think that's the big area of his game is the pace of play. Sometimes in the NCAA looks like it's overwhelming him from a defensive perspective. That's really the big knock on him right now is the turnovers, the puck management, the decision-making in the defensive end. The physical tools are there. He can play physical. He can bring that physical element. He can defend off the rush with his mobility and with his size, with his length, with his physicality, right? But it's the breakouts, it's the exit pass, it's the vision with the puck and a stick in the defensive end. It's some of that decision making under pressure of a forecheck, which is going to be really difficult for him to transition to at this current moment because it's only going to increase in terms of pace at the AHL or NHL level if he were to turn pro after the draft. So I think an NHL team would be very smart to be patient with him. I look at, say, a guy like Pavel Mintyukov with the Anaheim Ducks, right? They were fairly patient with him, sent him back to junior for another season because I would say that his decision-making was above where Levshunov's is right now, but there were some of those instances in his game where it was a little bit erratic. It was a little bit all over the place, and I think that's sort of what we see with Levshunov, and I think patience is going to be key here. I think this is a player who's probably going to need to go back for a sophomore year, then maybe a year in the AHL, and then he's going to be ready. The physical tools are there. Just I'd love to see sort of the decision-making and the confidence continue to evolve as a two-way player.
Is that something that's going to come with time, or is that something that like the NHL team that drafted him is going to have to sit down and be like, right, okay, this is what we're seeing. This is what we want you to work on. This is what we need you to do basically over next season? Or is it something that's literally like, because I feel like some problems are quote unquote problems. I feel like some things are things that are just, reps. Some things are things that you like actively need to work on. Is it, which one of those do you think his defensive capability is kind of sitting at?
Yeah, it's honestly a little bit of column A, a little column B here. The NHL team that drafts him is going to sit down with him. They're going to talk about a development path. They're going to talk about the things that they want him to work on. They're going to work in conjunction with Michigan State and talk to their coaches about the things that they want to see, right? It's going to be a team effort there. And the key there is Levshunov himself, right? Taking this feedback and working it into his game and improving in the defensive and improving his decision making. For some guys, it just doesn't improve, right? And that's where the risk with Levshunov is. Is it an application thing that just requires a little bit more experience, a little bit more coaching? Can he improve in that area, or is this something in his game that's going to hold him back from reaching his upside? And I think that's why you're going to see some teams who prefer your Sam Dickinsons, prefer your Anton Salayevs in that sort of top 7, top 8 range where we have a lot of defenders, a lot of high-end defenders available this year. And teams are going to have preferences elsewhere because they're going to be worried about some of that holding back Levshunov from being, say, a top 2, top 3 defender, or maybe more of a guy who plays a little bit lower down the lineup just because he's not processing the game at an elite level the way that you would expect a second or third D to do.
Yeah. So he's a guy that's basically generally considered to be a top 10 pick. He's ranked as low as 10 and as high as low as 20, as high as 2. I think the only person that has him outside of their top 10 is Tony Ferrari over at the Hockey News. Everyone else basically has him anywhere between 2 and 10. Is that, obviously that's a big window between 2nd overall and 10th overall, but like whereabouts do you see him falling on draft day? Obviously it depends on who's drafting where, but like what's the kind of the range that you'd expect a guy like Levshunov to go in?
Yeah, I think knowing Tony well, I know if you were to ask him, he would say that's his ranking. That's not where he would expect
for sure. And it's always so
go,
interesting.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So, I honestly would be shocked if he falls outside of like the top 6 or 7 at this point. Mm-hmm. Just the upside is too high. It's too tantalizing. A team is going to jump at the opportunity to add him in that range, and I would be shocked if he's not one of the first defenders off the board.
Going to finish up my conversation with Brock here in just a second, but first I'm going to tell you about eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. They've got superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you are into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. They've got over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, so you're always going to find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every single time, or you're going to get your money back. With eBay Motors, you are going to burn rubber, not cash. All the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to US customers. Yeah, I feel like it's always interesting to look at draft rankings. And like, I love Tony. Tony's great. We have him on the show all the time. I trust his draft rankings more than basically more than most of the pundits out there. But it's always so interesting to watch like scouts versus drafts. Again, I use the word pundit loosely. But like, I always feel like people get really mad about Bob McKenzie's rankings, for example. And I'm like, he's not ranking the prospects by how good they are. He's ranking them based on where he thinks they're going to go, which is a completely different ranking. So it's always so interesting to see like where a player lands on Bob McKenzie's ranking versus where he lands on everyone else's ranking, for example.
Yeah, it's the pinnacle because it's a poll of NHL scouts. It's not even Bob's ranking, right? It's a collection of his sources, his scouts providing him that information. These are where guys are slotted on teams' boards currently. And I think the one thing that I would say is I think teams have kind of become wise to that. I'm not saying they're feeding Bob false information, but
they've been a little cagey with it.
Yeah, I think the higher end guys for sure, it's quite accurate, but I think we're seeing a lot of like some of those hidden gems not be ranked as highly on Bob's list now, as teams are starting to become sort of wise to how much attention is paid to that list and how it's sort of that holy grail of the scouting community at this point, because it's very reflective of the NHL scouting community as opposed to our list of McKeen's or Tony's list of the Hockey News, Elite Prospects, Hockey Prospect, right? This is all, as you said, draft pundits. We are independent scouting agencies. We are not, yes, we're talking to NHL scouts and things like that, and we're incorporating some of that in our own beliefs and opinions 100%, but it's still our list, and it's not necessarily reflective of where we think those players are going to be selected. It's where we would personally have them ranked if we were running an NHL franchise, right?
Right. We talked a little bit about Zeev Buem earlier, and it's really easy to compare these two players, I think, just because they're both really talented offensive defensemen playing in the NCAA. Zeev Buem is a guy that I've kind of looked at as potentially being available for the Blue Jackets at 4. Obviously, Levshunov is probably going to be there as well. Where do you sit on the Levshunov versus Buem debate? Like, who would you, if you had the chance to pick, like, which one would you draft?
Yeah, I think it would have to be Levshunov. I think that Buem is 100% the safer player. And I know that sounds weird because Levshunov has that physical package, right? There is that size that Buem doesn't have, right? So normally you wouldn't say that about a player like Levshunov, that an undersized defender is a little bit safer than him. But I think that Buem's IQ makes him a safer NHL defender in some capacity. If you ask our scouting staff and McKeen's, we're very split on Buem. We have a few on our staff that absolutely love him, would advocate for him to be in that sort of top 7, top 8, top 9 range. And then we have others that are a little bit more hesitant regarding him, that would have him sort of in that mid to like mid-late first round, like we're talking like 15, 17, 18 range. And it's because sort of that exact opposite. Sorry, he doesn't have the physical tools that Levshunov, that Dickinson, that Artyom Yakimchuk, that Anton Salayev, all those guys have. And then when you compare him to a guy like Zane Parekh, I would argue Zane Parekh is a better skater, is a more dynamic and creative player than Buem. I think Buem's obviously best case scenario would be a guy like Adam Fox, right? The same sort of things were said about Adam Fox as an NCAA player. We're looking at that high IQ. He doesn't have the physical tools that we're looking for, but he's just so smart. The downside would be maybe a guy like Cam York, who has had a bit of difficulty transitioning to an NHL role as a true offensive defender. And I think that the downside with William would be in that, like, third pair consistent puck mover role, somebody who isn't a difference maker in your lineup, but who can play a regular shift and play a secondary power play unit and play for you, but not at the level maybe a guy like Levshunov does if he hits, right? So I would see Levshunov as more of a boom or bust player, whereas I see Boyum actually as being a little bit more safe. When I'm picking in that top 7, top 8 range, I'm going for the highest upside. I think that's something that you have to do. You have an opportunity within that range to draft a player who can be a difference maker for your franchise, somebody who can turn your franchise around, right? We're talking about a potential top pairing defender. We're talking about a potential top center or a first line forward, right? That's what you're aiming for. And William could definitely be it, but I think Levshunov's ceiling is just that little bit higher because those physical tools are just a little bit better.
Yeah, and it feels like a very Blue Jackets pick, Levshunov, because they've kind of, it's going to be really interesting because obviously there's a different GM at the helm right now in John Davidson, who's the interim. They might have a brand new GM by the time the draft rolls around. I certainly hope so anyway. But the Blue Jackets, the past kind of couple of years, what we've seen is they draft for skill and they draft for upside, and then they're like, and we'll figure the rest out. So Levshunov seems to fit perfectly in that. The defensemen in this draft are so interesting because I feel like every single person I've talked to has a different opinion on every single one of them. Like, I've talked to guys who are like, I would take Ziv Boehm 3rd overall if I could. And then I've talked to other guys that say he's maybe not even in my first round. Or Zane Prek is another guy that's really divisive. Levshunov's another guy. So I feel like every single draft expert has a different ranking for the defensemen specifically, which is so interesting. Because I feel like the forwards are kind of mostly in order. Like, you've got Celebrini, obviously, and then kind of any order of Demidov, Lindstrom, and Catton, and then Yzerman kind of following up with that. But the defensemen, it's such a wide spread of opinions that it's so hard to kind of really get an idea of what the actual ranking is going to be when it comes out.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. At the end of the day, it's a great year to draft a defender. Not only do you have that top end talent, but you've got great upside and talent all the way through the first round. It's just a really good year to draft a defenseman and need a defenseman. And that's sort of where the Blue Jackets kind of come in, right? This is the classic case of drafting need versus drafting to what you think is going to be the best player, right? I think that, and I'm not speaking for you, Jay, but when I look at Columbus' system, I would think that in a perfect world, you're trying to get another impact forward. You've got a lot of good defenders that you've drafted over the recent years, right? You've got Jiricek, you've got Denton McKeen, you've got Stanislav Soviezil, you got Corson Coolins. You've got a lot of defenders that you've drafted to have a good chance to be solid NHL defenders. Up front, you've got Adam Fantilli, you've got Kirill Marchenko, who's had a great year, Dmitry Voronikov, who's had a great year, right? You have some guys, but would a guy like Ivan Demidov make the most sense for Columbus at this point? That dynamic winger who can play alongside Adam Fantilli. If you wanted to create, well, obviously, I know that they've been using that Russian line with Chainikov as well, right, in there, but it gives you some flexibility there. And I think that in a perfect world, and if we're drafting just based on need, I could see Columbus going forward. But obviously, when you're drafting that high, you don't do that. At least in my opinion, you don't draft based on need because your needs are going to fluctuate. You take the player that you think is going to be the best NHL player. And like you said earlier, you figure it out. If you end up with a surplus, you do what Anaheim did, and you trade Jamie Drysdale for a top forward prospect, right? There's going to be those opportunities, especially if you're drafting a high-end defender. There's going to be those opportunities to move that defender for a quality forward. So it's going to be an interesting case as the draft draws closer. It also depends, obviously, what happens at the lottery, right? Columbus right now sitting 4th, I believe, right?
We're basically locked in at 4th, unless they go on a crazy win streak or Anaheim goes on a crazy win streak. It's probably going to be 4th. So.
Right. And then, I mean, okay, are you moving up? Are you very lucky to win the Celebrini lottery, right? That would be obviously amazing for your franchise. I think that's what everybody's hoping for, but there's also that chance, okay, maybe somebody underneath you guys moves up, you drop to 5th. Okay, now things are changing. I would say 5th is making you much less likely to get Ivan Demidov. I know there's that Russian factor, but I don't see him maybe falling the way that Michkov did last year. I think that Demidov probably is pretty locked in that sort of top 4. I'd be shocked if he falls out of it. So if you guys do fall down that spot, less likely that you're able to get him. Then are you looking at a Lindstrom? Are you looking at Cole Iserman, right? There's a lot of this draft in general is going to be so hard to try to mock. There's so many different things that I think even today are very unsettled. I think there's a lot of things up in the air currently.
Yeah, basically, like, so far in my mock draft, I have Celebrini penciled in as number 1, but I'm also hearing rumblings that, like, there are teams that might want to take Anton Silayev first overall, and I don't know how credible these rumblings are, but I'm definitely hearing them. That was actually the next question that I was going to ask about. Obviously, the Blue Jackets have Jiricek, Matejchuk, obviously Zach Werenski's still basically in his prime. They've got Damon Severson for the next 8 years, whether you enjoy that or not. They're already struggling to fit their young defensemen into the system. Do they go ahead? Like you said, do they take a guy like Demidov? Do they take Lindstrom or Catton and have like that Fantilli Lindstrom or Fantilli Catton 1-2 punch down the middle? So I guess like let's finish off this episode with like Blue Jackets get locked in at 4th overall. Who are you drafting at fourth overall?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a loaded question, right? Because it just depends on who's there. Honestly,
assuming that you're like 1, 2, and 3 go 1, 2, and 3, who's like 4th on your draft board right now?
That's still up in the air. Honestly, I think that right now I feel very confident in saying that Celebrini and Demidov are 1, 2 on my personal draft board, and I don't see that changing over the course of the rest of this little stretch of closing out season here. I think that depending on how things go, it could be Sam Dickinson. I want to see how he plays in the playoffs with London. They've got a lot of pressure on them as one of the top seeds in the Western Conference. I want to see how he handles being a top defender on a team that has championship aspirations. I'm curious about how some guys play at the U18s. I think Cole Iserman, I know we're writing him off, but if he comes into the U18s and has an absolute monster performance where, he's the best forward in that tournament, I think we're going to see him push back up draft boards, right? There's a guy that has a lot to prove based on some inconsistency in his play, especially away from the puck. You've got some other defenders, Zane Parekh, who's going to be battling for Memorial Cup this year with Saginaw. There's just so many different variables. I know I said it earlier, and I know you said if you're locked in. I think in a perfect world for Columbus, you're winning the lottery, you're getting inside that top 2 or top 3, and you're trying to get Demidov or you're trying to get Celebrini. I think that's the perfect situation for Columbus. You're getting the best player, and you're getting a player who does fit more of a need for your organization. If you're drafting a guy like Caden Lindstrom, it does give you some flexibility. I think I've spoken to people. I know our Western scouts, McKeen's have spoken to people who believe that he might settle more on the wing at the pro level. Yes, there's an opportunity for him to stick down the middle, but you could give yourself a 1-2 punch at wing and center with Fantilli and Lindstrom. That's 2 physical beasts who bring speed, who bring size, who bring physicality, right? That could be very interesting and tantalizing to that opportunity, right? Anton Silayev, a little bit different than what you've currently got in the defensive system right now for Columbus. Yes, David Jiricek is good in his own end, but I don't think that any of the guys that are currently in the system have that sort of shutdown potential that Silayev does. And I think he could be very interesting to Columbus's scouting staff as well. I think if we have this conversation in a month and a half, my answer might change. It honestly might. But I think what I'll say is, in a perfect world, you're just hoping to win the lottery or hoping to get second or third, and you're trying to get one of those impact forwards that's available. Then you don't have to make that decision of who's going to be the best defenseman, because honestly, it's such a difficult question to try to answer right now because they're very, very close.
Yeah, we're in that weird point of the season where it's almost done, but there's still some guys that are probably going to make a push one way or the other. You mentioned Sam Dickinson. We're actually going to talk about him in a little bit for tomorrow's episode. But if people want to learn maybe a little bit more about Levshunov or scouting in general, or they want to get kind of more prospect information in their lives, I know I always want more prospect information in my life. Where can people find you and your work online?
Yeah, so my work's at McKeensHockey.com. We do have a decent amount of stuff open to everybody to see, especially some of our scouting reports this year. Our top 32 for our rankings is always available. We have a draft guide. We have lots of content on the site. You can find a lot of great information on our site about draft prospects.
And that's all I've got for today. Like I said, later on tonight, we're going to talk about the Carolina Hurricanes game last night. And I've got a bunch of fun mailbag questions as well. So we're going to do that. And then tomorrow, I've got another one of these prospect profiles with Brock that I recorded last week. We're going to be talking about Sam Dickinson of the London Knights. So that's coming up later on today and also tomorrow on Locked On Blue Jackets. Thank you for listening. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day every single day. Locked On Blue Jackets is free and available on all podcast platforms, over on YouTube and on SiriusXM. I have been Jeff Foster. You can find me on Twitter at _Jacob Foster, JAKOBFORSTER. You can find the show at LO_Blue Jackets on Twitter and also Instagram. You can email me if you have comments, questions, criticisms at lockedonbluejackets@gmail.com. And until tomorrow, make sure you stay locked on.